Welcome to Gaming Sim Life, where we explore the intersections of philosophy, theology, and the big questions of existence. I'm your host, Dev, and today we're diving deep into the fascinating world of Thomas Aquinas and his famous proofs of God's existence. Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Italian Dominican friar, priest, and immensely influential philosopher and theologian, stands as a towering figure in Western thought. His work bridged the gap between faith and reason, integrating Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology in a way that continues to resonate today. Our focus will be on his 5 proofs of God's existence, also known as the 5 ways, which have sparked centuries of debate and contemplation. Before we delve into the proofs themselves, let's briefly explore Aquinas' background. Born around 1225 near Aquino, Italy, Thomas came from a noble family. His early education at the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino set the stage for his later intellectual pursuits. At the University of Naples, he encountered the works of Aristotle, which would profoundly influence his thinking. Despite his family's opposition, Aquinas joined the Dominican order, dedicating his life to scholarship and the Church. His most famous works include the Summa Theologica and Summa Contra Gentiles, monumental texts that systematically address theological and philosophical questions. These works showcase Aquinas' remarkable ability to synthesize diverse intellectual traditions, particularly the integration of Aristotelian thought with Christian doctrine. Now, let's turn our attention to the 5 proofs themselves. These arguments, presented in Aquinas' Summa Theologica, aim to demonstrate the existence of God through reason and observation of the natural world. It's important to note that Aquinas didn't view these as definitive proofs in the modern sense, but rather as ways of understanding God's existence that align with both faith and reason. The 5 proofs are: 1. The argument from motion. 2. The argument from causation. 3. The argument from contingency. 4. The argument from degree. 5. The argument from teleology or design. Each of these arguments follows a similar structure, beginning with an observation about the natural world and concluding with the necessity of God's existence. Aquinas' approach was groundbreaking in its attempt to reconcile philosophical reasoning with religious belief, setting a precedent for centuries of theological and philosophical discourse. Now, let's examine each of these proofs in detail, starting with the argument from motion. The argument from motion, also known as the prime mover argument, is rooted in Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. Aquinas begins by observing that motion exists in the world. By motion, he doesn't just mean spatial movement, but any kind of change or transition from potentiality to actuality. Aquinas argues that everything that moves is moved by something else. This is because, according to Aristotelian physics, nothing can move itself from potentiality to actuality. For instance, a ball doesn't roll unless something pushes it, and water doesn't heat up unless a flame or other heat source acts upon it. He then reasons that this chain of movers and things moved cannot extend infinitely into the past. If it did, there would be no first mover and consequently no movement at all. Therefore, there must be a first mover that is itself unmoved, a prime mover. This prime mover, Aquinas concludes, is what we understand as God. The significance of this argument lies in its attempt to logically deduce the existence of God from observable phenomena. It suggests that the very fact of change and motion in the universe necessitates the existence of an unchanging, eternal being that initiates all motion. Critics of this argument often point out that it relies on outdated physics and a potentially flawed understanding of causality. Modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics, challenges the notion that every event must have a cause. Additionally, some argue that even if a first mover is necessary, it doesn't necessarily follow that this mover has the attributes traditionally associated with God. Despite these criticisms, the argument from motion remains influential in philosophical theology. It raises profound questions about the nature of causality, the origins of change, and the fundamental structure of reality. Moving on to the second proof, the argument from causation, we find a closely related but distinct line of reasoning. This argument focuses on the concept of efficient causes, the agents that bring about effects in the world. Aquinas observes that in the world, we see a series of efficient causes. Nothing, he argues, can be the efficient cause of itself, because that would mean it existed prior to its own existence, which is logically impossible. Therefore, every effect must have a cause distinct from itself. Like the argument from motion, Aquinas contends that this series of causes cannot extend infinitely into the past. If it did, there would be no first cause and consequently no effects at all. Therefore, there must be a first efficient cause, which Aquinas identifies as God. This argument is more abstract than the first, dealing with metaphysical causality rather than physical motion. It suggests that the very existence of causal relationships in the universe points to a necessary first cause that is itself uncaused. Critics of this argument often challenge the assumption that an infinite regress of causes is impossible. Some philosophers argue that while we may not be able to conceive of an infinite series of causes, this doesn't mean it can't exist. Others point out that even if a first cause is necessary, it doesn't follow that this cause must have the attributes traditionally associated with God. Defenders of the argument, however, maintain that it provides a compelling reason to believe in a necessary being that exists outside the chain of contingent causes. They argue that without such a being, the existence of anything at all becomes inexplicable. The third proof, the argument from contingency, delves even deeper into metaphysical territory. This argument centers on the distinction between necessary and contingent beings. Aquinas begins by observing that things in the world come into being and pass away. In other words, they are contingent, they don't have to exist, and at one point they didn't exist. He argues that if everything were contingent, then at some point in the past, nothing would have existed at all. But if nothing had ever existed, then nothing would exist now, because something cannot come from nothing. Since things clearly do exist now, Aquinas concludes that not everything can be contingent. There must be at least one necessary being whose existence is not contingent on anything else. This necessary being, he argues, is what we call God. This argument is particularly interesting because it doesn't rely on the impossibility of an infinite regress. Instead, it focuses on the nature of existence itself. It suggests that the very fact that contingent beings exist at all points to the existence of a necessary being. Critics of this argument often challenge the assumption that a universe of only contingent beings is impossible. Some argue that the universe itself might be the necessary being, eliminating the need for a transcendent God. Others question whether the categories of necessary and contingent are meaningful when applied to existence itself. Defenders of the argument, however, maintain that it provides a powerful explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. They argue that a necessary being, understood as God, provides the most satisfying answer to this fundamental question of existence. The fourth proof, the argument from degree, takes a different approach. Instead of focusing on causality or existence, it examines the degrees of perfection we observe in the world. Aquinas begins by noting that we observe varying degrees of perfection in things. Some things are more or less good, true, noble, and so on. He argues that we can only make these comparisons by reference to a maximum. For instance, we can only say that one thing is hotter than another by reference to maximum heat. Following this logic, Aquinas concludes that there must be a maximum being that possesses all perfections to the highest degree. This being, he argues, is what we understand as God. This argument is perhaps the most abstract of the five. It suggests that the very fact that we can make comparative judgments about qualities like goodness or truth implies the existence of a perfect being that serves as the standard for these comparisons. Critics of this argument often challenge the assumption that degrees of perfection necessitate a maximum. They argue that we can make comparative judgments without reference to an absolute maximum. For instance, we can say that one day is warmer than another without implying the existence of a maximally hot day. Defenders of the argument, however, maintain that it provides insight into the nature of value and perfection. They argue that without a transcendent source of goodness or truth, our judgments about these qualities become arbitrary or subjective. The fifth and final proof, the argument from teleology or design, is perhaps the most intuitive and has had the most lasting impact on popular apologetic. This argument focuses on the apparent purposefulness or goal-directedness we observe in nature. Aquinas begins by observing that natural bodies, which lack intelligence, nevertheless act for an end or purpose. For instance, a plant grows towards the light, or an acorn develops into an oak tree. He argues that things that lack intelligence can only act for an end if they are directed by an intelligent being. From this, Aquinas concludes that there must be an intelligent being that directs all of nature towards its ends. This being, he argues, is what we call God. This argument differs from the others in that it focuses on the apparent design or purpose in nature, rather than on abstract metaphysical principles. It suggests that the order and purposefulness we observe in the natural world point to an intelligent designer. Critics of this argument often point out that it seems to ignore the possibility of natural selection and other non-teleological explanations for apparent design in nature. They argue that complex, seemingly purposeful structures can arise through purely naturalistic processes. Defenders of the argument, however, maintain that it remains relevant even in light of evolutionary theory. They argue that the fundamental laws and constants of the universe that allow for the emergence of life and complexity still require explanation, and that an intelligent designer provides the best explanation for these fine-tuned conditions. Now that we've examined each of the 5 proofs in detail, it's important to consider the criticisms and counterarguments that have been leveled against them over the centuries. These critiques come from various philosophical and scientific perspectives, and have shaped the ongoing dialogue about the existence of God and the nature of reality. Historically, one of the earliest and most influential critics of Aquinas' proofs was the 18th century philosopher David Hume. In his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, Hume challenged several key assumptions underlying the proofs. For instance, Hume questioned whether we can apply concepts like causality, which we derive from our limited experience of the world, to the universe as a whole or to a transcendent being like God. He argued that our understanding of cause and effect is based on habit and custom rather than logical necessity, undermining the force of arguments that rely on causal chains. Hume also famously critiqued the argument from design, pointing out that our experience of design is always of imperfect human artifacts, not of universes or perfect beings. He suggested that even if the universe shows signs of design, this doesn't necessarily point to an all-powerful, all-knowing, or morally perfect creator. In the modern era, criticisms of Aquinas' proofs have come from various directions. Atheistic and agnostic philosophers have challenged the logical structure of the arguments, questioning whether they truly demonstrate the existence of a being with the attributes traditionally ascribed to God. For example, philosopher Bertrand Russell argued that the concept of a necessary being is itself problematic. He suggested that while we can conceive of individual things as either necessary or contingent, it doesn't make sense to apply these categories to existence as a whole. Scientific developments have also posed challenges to Aquinas' proofs. The theory of evolution by natural selection, for instance, provides an alternative explanation for the apparent design in nature, potentially undermining the force of the teleological argument. Quantum mechanics has challenged our classical notions of causality, suggesting that at the most fundamental level, events may occur without deterministic causes. This potentially undermines arguments that rely on strict causal chains leading back to a first cause. Cosmological theories like the Big Bang model have raised questions about the nature of time and the beginning of the universe. While some see these theories as supporting the idea of a cosmic beginning that requires a creator, others argue that they simply push the question of origins back to a point where our current understanding of physics breaks down. Philosophical counterarguments have come from various traditions. Some philosophers have argued for the possibility of an infinite regress, challenging Aquinas' assumption that causal chains must have a beginning. Others have suggested that the universe itself might be the necessary being or the uncaused cause, eliminating the need for a transcendent God. Responses to these criticisms have come from many quarters. Some theologians and philosophers have sought to update and refine Aquinas' arguments in light of modern science and philosophy. Others have argued that while the proofs may not provide ironclad logical demonstrations of God's existence, they still offer compelling reasons for belief or point to the rational coherence of theism. For instance, some modern defenders of the cosmological argument have reformulated it in terms of the beginning of the universe, arguing that the Big Bang theory supports the idea of a cosmic beginning that requires a transcendent cause. Defenders of the teleological argument have pointed to the fine-tuning of physical constants and laws as evidence of design at a cosmic scale, arguing that this level of fine-tuning is better explained by an intelligent designer than by chance or necessity. Despite the critiques, Aquinas' 5 proofs continue to be influential in philosophical theology and apologetic. They raise profound questions about the nature of existence, causality, and the foundations of reality that remain relevant to contemporary debates. Moving on to the relevance and impact of Aquinas' proofs, it's important to recognize their profound influence on Christian theology, interfaith dialogues, and contemporary philosophical debates. In terms of Christian theology, Aquinas' work, including the 5 proofs, has been particularly influential within the Catholic tradition. The Catholic Church has long embraced Aquinas' synthesis of faith and reason, seeing in his work a powerful intellectual foundation for Christian belief. The proofs have played a significant role in Catholic apologetic, providing rational arguments for God's existence that complement faith-based approaches. They have influenced the development of Catholic doctrine, particularly in areas relating to natural theology, the attempt to understand God through reason and observation of the natural world. Aquinas' influence extends beyond Catholicism, however. His work has been studied and engaged with by theologians and philosophers from various Christian denominations, contributing to the broader Christian intellectual tradition. In terms of interfaith dialogues, Aquinas' proofs have played an interesting role. While rooted in Christian theology, the proofs draw heavily on philosophical traditions that are shared with other monotheistic religions, particularly Islam and Judaism. In fact, Aquinas was influenced by Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes, who had already engaged in similar attempts to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with monotheistic theology. This shared intellectual heritage has made Aquinas' work a fruitful ground for interfaith philosophical discussions. Comparative analyses have been made between Aquinas' proofs and arguments for God's existence in Islamic philosophy, such as Al-Ghazali's cosmological argument. Similarly, Jewish philosophers have engaged with Aquinas' work, finding both points of agreement and divergence with their own theological traditions. These interfaith engagements highlight the universal nature of the questions Aquinas grappled with. While the specific theological conclusions might differ, the fundamental questions about the nature of existence, causality, and the divine are shared across many religious and philosophical traditions. In terms of contemporary relevance, Aquinas' proofs continue to be debated and discussed in both academic philosophy and popular apologetic. While few philosophers today would argue that the proofs provide irrefutable demonstrations of God's existence, many still find them valuable as starting points for thinking about the relationship between God and the world. In modern apologetic, versions of Aquinas' arguments are often used as part of a cumulative case for theism. Apologists argue that while each proof may not be conclusive on its own, taken together they provide strong reasons for belief in God. The proofs have also influenced contemporary philosophical debates on a range of issues. For instance, discussions of necessary beings and contingency in modal logic often trace their roots back to Aquinas' 3rd proof. The fine-tuning argument in physics, which suggests that the fundamental constants of the universe are improbably well-suited for life, can be seen as a modern version of the teleological argument. Even for those who ultimately reject the proofs, engaging with them can provide valuable insights into the nature of existence, causality, and the limits of human reason. The proofs raise fundamental questions about why there is something rather than nothing, whether the universe had a beginning, and whether the apparent order we observe in nature requires explanation. In this way, Aquinas' proofs continue to shape philosophical and theological discourse, providing a framework for thinking about some of the most fundamental questions of existence. They serve as a bridge between ancient and modern thought, between faith and reason, and between different religious and philosophical traditions. As we conclude our exploration of Thomas Aquinas and his proofs of God's existence, let's recap the key points we've covered. We began by introducing Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Dominican friar whose work profoundly influenced Western philosophy and theology. We discussed his major works, including the Summa Theologica, and his unique synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. We then delved into the 5 proofs themselves. 1. The argument from motion, which reasons from the existence of change to a first unchanging mover. 2. The argument from causation, which posits a first cause based on the chain of efficient causes we observe in the world. 3. The argument from contingency, which argues for a necessary being from the existence of contingent beings. 4. The argument from degree, which reasons from the degrees of perfection we observe to a maximum perfect being. 5. The argument from teleology, which argues for an intelligent designer based on the apparent purposefulness in nature. We examined each of these proofs in detail, discussing their logical structure, philosophical implications, and potential weaknesses. We then explored various criticisms and counterarguments that have been leveled against the proofs over the centuries, from both philosophical and scientific perspectives. Finally, we discussed the ongoing relevance and impact of Aquinas' work, including its influence on Christian theology, its role in interfaith dialogues, and its continued importance in contemporary philosophical debates. The enduring significance of Aquinas' contributions cannot be overstated. His 5 proofs, while not universally accepted, have shaped centuries of philosophical and theological discourse. They represent a bold attempt to bridge the gap between faith and reason, to provide rational grounds for religious belief, and to grapple with some of the most fundamental questions about existence and reality. These proofs continue to challenge us to think deeply about the nature of the universe, the limits of human knowledge, and the possibility of a transcendent reality beyond the physical world we observe. Whether one ultimately finds them convincing or not, engaging with Aquinas' arguments can lead to a deeper understanding of these profound philosophical questions. As we conclude, I encourage you, our listeners, to continue exploring these ideas. Aquinas' proofs are not meant to be the end of inquiry, but rather the beginning of a deeper contemplation of existence and the divine. Consider how these arguments relate to your own beliefs and experiences. How do they align with or challenge your understanding of the world? I invite you to share your thoughts and questions about today's episode. Your perspectives and insights can enrich this ongoing dialogue and help us all deepen our understanding of these complex issues. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought from Aquinas himself. He once wrote, "Wonder is the desire for knowledge." In many ways, this simple statement encapsulates the spirit of philosophical inquiry that we've explored today. May we all continue to wonder, to question, and to seek understanding. Thank you once again for listening to Gaming Sim Life. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep wondering about the mysteries of existence. This is your host, Dev, signing off.
We've already made so much progress. It seems we're on a lucky streak. We should expand the network even further.
I have to disagree, Mira. It would be best to first establish a solid base before further expansion.
Oh, right. Well then, we should use our lucky streak to build a solid base.